Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to the Animals and Society Colloquium today featuring Dr. Sarah May Lindsay. Before we get started, I just want to introduce the Colloquium series. It is a partnership between the Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association. My name is Carol Glasser, and I'm currently serving as the chair of that section, and the Animals and Society Institute. And I'd like to introduce Gala Argent to introduce the Animals and Society Institute and tell you a little bit about it. You are muted still.
Hello, welcome. The Animals and Society Institute is a think tank that promotes human-animal studies, the field of human-animal studies, and I'm going to put a link in the chat so that you can see what we do. We also, as a function of this colloquium, post the recordings to our website, and I will include that link as well in the chat. There are resources for scholars, for students, for practitioners there, and I think you'll find a lot of interesting information. So, thank you, Carol.
Thank you so much for that. So right now we're aiming to do about one colloquium every month during the academic year. And if you want to be on an email list for that, make sure that you had an opportunity when you registered for this event. But if you're a member of the ASA section on Animals and Society, or if you are on the ASI email list, you'll get mailings about this. But if you don't think you're on either of those lists, you can always send a private message to me using the chat feature, and I'll make sure we get your email address on an email list so that you're alerted when we have these. But without further ado, I'd like to turn our attention to the colloquium that you all came here today to hear. So today's colloquium, Service, Support, or Companion, Intersections of Species, Ability, and Care in Intimate Partner Violence Shelters, is presenting the work of Dr. Sarah May Lindsay. I'm very excited to tell you all that in this past month, Sarah May has moved from being Ms. Sarah May Lindsay to Dr. Sarah May Lindsay, and has successfully defended her dissertation. So we are all very excited about that. So congratulations. And I'm really excited for this colloquium because it's sort of a peek at some of the work that Sarah May did for their dissertation. Dr. Sarah May Lindsay is in the Sociology program at McMaster University. Dr. Lindsay's research areas include human, non-human animal relations, human and non-human animal shelters and housing, non-human companion animals, non-human animal use and abuse, environmentalism and social movements, disability, disease, deviance, and speciesism. She works from the intersectional perspective of critical animal studies and vegan sociology, leveraging progressive pedagogy for social change. Dr. Lindsay's dissertation research surveys companion animal co-sheltering policies and practices at women's emergency shelters in Ontario, Canada. Recent publications include a journal article on the problem of multi-species families and emergency women's shelters, and a co-authored introductory chapter on the connectivity of critical animal and critical disability studies. Dr. Lindsay is also co-chair of CSA's Animals and Society Research Cluster, elected counsel and newsletter editor of the ASA's Animals and Society section, assistant editor of the Student Journal of Vegan Sociology, organizing member of the Canadian Violence Link Coalition and biannual conference, and a member of the Animal and Interpersonal Abuse Research Group and the International Association of Vegan Sociologists. So all that together, we know that Dr. Lindsay really knows what she's talking about, and we're going to learn a lot today. Before I hand it over to Dr. Lindsay, I'd like to remind everyone to make sure that you are muted. If you have any questions, you can feel free to put them up in the chat, but the format we're going to use today is to have Dr. Lindsay present her talk, and then for the second half of today's colloquium, we will have a moderated question and answer session where you can either post your questions in the chat or go ahead and raise your hand to ask questions. But for the first portion, we're going to let Sarah May have the floor, or the Zoom as it is here. So with that, I turn it over to you, Dr. Lindsay.
Thank you very much, Carol, for that very kind introduction. I'm very, very pleased to be here today. This is one of the first opportunities I'm having to discuss a finding in particular that arose from my research that I wasn't even expecting, or I didn't have on my radar when I began this project. So please do call me Sarah May. I use the pronouns she and her. And at the end of the presentation, I'll provide an email address where you can reach me, because I really want this to be the start of a discussion. So let's make sure there we go. We're on a roll. I would manage to change the screen. I want to make sure that everyone is aware that there are discussions of violence. There aren't images of violence, but there are discussions of violence in this presentation. So if you want to step away, you need to come back to this. It is being recorded, so please do take advantage of that opportunity to step away if you need to, because the topic, even though important, is often very difficult for a lot of people to encounter, including myself. So in this talk today, I really want to start to kind of position why I started to think about non-human animals, and in particular companion animals and violence together. And as sociologists or others who are working in fields that we see the power of categorization. I found this out, and I'll tell you in a moment, when I was very young, that there were binaries in society. I didn't call them binaries, but I knew there were differences, and that these differences were sometimes connected to use or value. And the use or value of one individual or another, I started to understand, was very much tied to human interpretation, of course, to human dominance. Of course, categorization is not something that I completely dismiss in my work. I simply question its use and what it means, because in our super complex world, it would be incredibly difficult to navigate our everyday lives without creating, and we very much do this, some kind of categorization for everything around us. Where I find in this particular presentation, the most, I guess I would say, the most problems are when these categories really come into play for inclusion and exclusion in certain situations. Very much access to social services, which is the type of institution that I'm studying in this presentation. Now, this image on the right, for those who use alternate ways to view items, presentations, I'd like to describe the images as best I can. There is alternate text as well provided. The images of a young girl and a black Labrador dog kind of embracing with a backyard scene behind it. Now, this is myself and a dog that I had the very great joy of living with when I was young. Her name was Marlo. And the reason that I include this here is this is the very instance where that categorization and violence met. This was in 1985, this photo was taken, and not too long after that, there was an unfortunate, terrible incident where I learned that non-human animals are not valued as much by society in many cases, and that punishment for violent acts is not the same at all, as we still to this day know, for acts against non-human animals. So this, I also learned in this very unique instance, which I now really value, for at least in this sense, was that stray animals, they had their own kind of system, the way that our system handled stray animals. This is when I learned about animal shelters and my continued interest in animal shelters, as Marlo was a stray who was originally taken to a shelter by my parents. And then luckily, she was adopted into our family because no one had claimed her. Now, Marlo only lived with us for a few years, because the incident that occurred was that I was at my grandparents' house and I came home and Marlo wasn't there. And I wanted to, where the heck is Marlo? And I was quickly told that this individual in our neighborhood, who I later learned was extremely well known for this type of behavior, yet had never been in trouble for it, He was forbidden from having non-human animals in the home. He was a young adult, a man, and he had thrown what the vet described as a steak laden with enough rat poison to kill a horse over the fence, and Marlowe had consumed it and had died very quickly from this event. Nothing happened to that individual person from my knowledge, other than I tried to confront him and was quickly stopped by my mother and his mother, interestingly enough. Now, I think it's very important to note that this work, like many other incredible minds and scholars in work that has to do especially with non-human animals, it's often informed by personal experiences or connections or just observations about systems that impact you directly. And so while I was, of course, thinking about non-human animals and shelters and companion animals in particular, later on in my life, when I went to leave an abusive relationship, I am a survivor of intimate partner violence, and I think it's very important that I announce that and identify that so that you see my positionality and, of course, recognize any biases that might be in this work. But I went to try to access emergency housing. So in Ontario, I live in Ontario, and that is a place where I was living at the time that this happened. We have intimate partner violence shelters, which I know are in the US as well. Sometimes they're called women's shelters or family shelters or violence against women's shelters. And they are specific facilities that are designed for individual women. Interesting, that's a whole nother discussion. It's usually women who are allowed and who enter these shelters, as well as their children occasionally in some of these facilities. So these women will flee the home, and where do they go? Now, later on in the presentation, I bring in class, the women in this study, and like myself, who had very limited options to move on or move away from violence. Where do they go is a question that I came to myself, where I attempted to enter 3 shelters in the southwestern part of Ontario. And these are emergency shelters, and I was turned away at each one because I had a cat. And in this photo, there's a young girl, that's my daughter Amber, a couple of years after the incident, and our sweet Silver, who is no longer with us. And because I wasn't able to move into the shelter with my daughter and Silver, I chose to remain in the violent situation for quite a while. So all that being said, you could probably guess that I care a little bit about this topic, but today I'm bringing something into it that is also close to me, to my work and to my life in general, which is ability, and as I said earlier, access. When I was doing this work, I came some really emergent themes came about, but they were all grounded in the environment. So my background, my bachelor's was in environmental studies. I really believe that where we are has such an impact and influence, a lot of power in itself. And so these places in this study are, for one, the violent home that the woman or family are leaving. And then on the other hand, these spaces, which are often communal, and there are a couple of different types of shelter or levels of shelter in Ontario. The one that was most studied in this particular work is a first stage shelter. So this is where the women are immediately leaving and staying in the shelter for a short term. Usually about 30 days is the maximum amount of time they're able to stay in these shelters. Of course, there's complex things about that, such as affordable housing and the lack thereof that I don't have time for here. But that is the intention of these spaces, these environments, is to protect the women, get them out of the situation, allow them a chance to recover, or at least take stock of what has happened and what perhaps will happen in the future. And of course, when you're thinking about these spaces, that you think about them as very human spaces. But in my work and in my experience, I find that is can be really destructive and also preventative for some individuals to escape violent situations. So when I started speaking to my participants, so what I did is I went out into the field. I did some phone interviews, but most of these were in person pre-COVID in 2018. And I asked questions about policies and about experiences and ideas to shelter workers. So these were women who, interestingly enough, all women who were working with the individuals in the shelters. Their job was to support them, connect them to community supports and to other services, and to help them move forward. So that's the human focus of my work. But in talking about the clients, I learned quite a bit about the other types of beings, non-human animals, that were either in the shelter or were refused from the shelter. And what started to come out in the research were that there were, again, categories of animals, not just non-human animals, but categories of non-human animals. And that these categories really meant something different, and to not just the humans who are using these facilities or the shelter workers themselves, but that the impact of these categories really meant very different outcomes and opportunities for different non-human animals in these emergency spaces. In this slide, I have an image of a cat sitting on a Ticket to Ride game. That's one of my sweet rescue girls, Phoebe, and she loves to help. And I thought it would be an important image to put along this kind of introduction to a large theme in my work, which is what are these groupings and these categories of individuals that I'm speaking about? What does it really mean if they are in different categories? And of course, to really bring focus to the companion animals, which is where I began this research. It's very important to know that companion animals, or pets, which I don't use that term, basically because of its association with possession. And in Canada, under Canadian law, I believe it is the same in the US, non-human animals are very clearly thought of and discussed and organized around the assumption that they are property. So non-human animals are not considered beings under the law. The same as a human being, they are considered human property. Interesting though, and very interestingly enough, and very much in contrast to that that particular law and organization, was that the clients and the shelter workers, both that were discussed in my research, very much thought of the companion animals in their lives as either kin, so very family, or akin to children, which is an interesting observation. I can see how some individuals would feel that non-human companion animals are akin to children. One quote that's not on this slide here was from one of my participants who said that, they're not quite like children because I've never had the level of destruction in my shelter that children make. Human children, that non-human animals are much less bother. And I thought that was an interesting opinion and an interesting observation. That individual had worked in shelters for a very long time. But I have some very clear indication from my sample that not just the shelter workers, but the women that they served believe that companion animals were family, saying things like they are family. One person said, I'll see women who'll give up stuff, and they've given up stuff so that their pets have it. And I've seen it for years, and they treat them better than themselves at times. And it's that unconditional peace that quite often humans can't give to humans, right? And then the same kind of line of thinking, another participant was talking about when a companion animal was not allowed to come into shelter with one of their clients. And they said, and that loss, not being able to bring the pets, can be such a significant loss, a barrier to physical safety, but also mental, emotional safety as well. And it can definitely be detrimental to someone's mental health, to lose that pet that's like part of their family, their only source of support. And there were other respondents who said that the companion animals that their clients shared their lives with were their only family. Now, when you think about violence in a relationship and in a home, it's very, very well known that the non-human, and it's very clear if you understand the situation, that non-human animals are very much involved in that in various ways. Sometimes it is very obvious as that the non-human animals are also harmed, but sometimes it's a little bit less. This is why I think it's important to really discuss this. It might not really, the connection might not really be made between safety, companion animals, violence, and escaping a violent home. But I did hear from from quite a few participants accounts of what could happen, what has happened, and exactly how strong the bonds were between their clients and their companion animals. One participant said that when women come to the shelter, you never see them go back to the abuser's home to pick up their toaster, but they'll brave going back to that abuser's home to pick up their animal. Another participant spoke about the significance or the urgency of considering non-human animals in these kind of situations where a woman is living in a violent relationship. She said that this is a life or death situation. We've got, since she was giving me a date range, 4 women have been murdered by their partners in our region. One was 9 months pregnant and her baby was killed, of course, with her. And the woman was murdered, and then he murdered 2 of their 3 teenage children. In my past, it's always been talking about enhancing people's life by enabling them to have animals around them. Here, the urgency is even greater because women, if they don't leave, they're at risk of being murdered. And I will extend that quote and say, so are the non-human animals. So thinking about access and thinking about the positionality of non-human animals and how humans view them and what their importance or significance is in their lives, we can see that this is handled in different ways depending on the category of non-human animal in question, or the pairing of the person and the non-human animal. So earlier in the presentation, I mentioned these 4 categories of animals that were kind of uncovered or pointed to in the work. I don't mention therapy animals here. The 3 prominent types of animals that were brought up were, of course, companion animals and also service animals. So service animals in Canada, I'll talk a little bit of more specifics in Ontario in a second, but service animals in Canada, there are some particular rules by province about what a service animal is, what they do, and where they are allowed to go. There is much less certainty anyways, according to policies and laws, about companion animals and emotional support animals, other than they are viewed as not the same and less maybe important or useful to the humans that are, basically covered by these laws. Specifically to Ontario, we have an act called the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And in this act, they mention service animals, companion animals or pets, and emotional support animals. And they designate these into these 3 categories. They say that in Ontario, any service provider, so that includes an intimate partner violence shelter, must accommodate the service animal in their shelter. Companion animals are viewed by the AODA as not the same, as I said, as to service animals or emotional support animals. And the AODA also says that emotional support animals are similar to companion animals, and they're definitely not service animals. So what does this look like in these shelters? Well, what it looks like is that service animals are allowed into the shelter. There are accessible spaces for the humans that live with them and the non-human animals. They might have their own outdoor access space to go to a yard, to use the washroom, etc. And that the shelter workers in my sample really accepted their admittance. They were absolutely, we let service animals in, even though it's not really in our mandate. We have to follow the rules, the guidelines, and the laws. That being said, there are very few experiences with service animals in my sample. And if they were often very much described as connected to a visible disability. And I can describe, you might think right away, like, oh, a guide dog. Yeah, kind of like that. They talked about individuals in wheelchairs. They talked about a few individuals who are vision impaired. They even spoke about a woman who was in a hospital bed with her service animal. So they talked about this as a positive, and that it was necessary. When it came to companion animals, I found a few shelters in my sample who co-sheltered. And so what that meant is, in various forms, they would allow the companion animal to remain with the woman, maybe in her room or perhaps in a slightly different area of the shelter, but they were still kept together in some form. There was an idea that this was an important thing to do by the co-shelterers. This was perhaps, like I said, a life or death issue, and that these companion animals were like family and should be considered maybe considered to the same as a child, perhaps, who needed to escape this violent situation as well. There wasn't much said about, why the people that I spoke to who said, I don't know about if this is really an urgent issue. They were concerned that this was taking the focus off, like co-shelterers were taking the focus off of the human victims. And they would say things like, oh, companion animals, they're important, but, the big but, this is not the place for them. Emotional support animals were another ball of wax. Basically, they are also not in the mandate of IPV shelters. They were associated with, not surprisingly, invisible disability, so neurodiversity, perhaps mental illness. And they were also said to be a type of fake service animal. So they told me about individuals who would say, no, this is my emotional support dog. I must have them, just like a service animal, which is interesting because you see the clients having some awareness that service animals are allowed, and therefore maybe they could smudge the line there and have their emotional support animal allowed into the shelter with them. In all this work, I really keep coming back to, what about the animals? These are perhaps, there's a lot more questions at this point than there are answers, but what I can tell you is that very much there is an abundance of different types of shelters for individuals in Canada and in Ontario specifically. For humans, it's very siloed. So there are shelters for youth, there are shelters, for older individuals, there are shelters for people who are leaving prisons and coming back into the community. There are shelters for homeless individuals, shelters for men, and of course, IPV shelters and non-human animal shelters. It's very siloed, and even though there might be some, I did find some activity where an IPV shelter and an animal shelter would work together in their community to try to perhaps offer fostering of the non-human animals while the woman is in shelter, or some other kind of alternate arrangement, which is perhaps particularly important when you start to consider the environment and if it is what our responsibility is to the companion animals that are wrapped up in these violent situations, who are often victims themselves. We know that there is a very large correlation, or at least a lot has been found, that the non-human animals are just as much a victim, victimized in different ways, perhaps used as tools. to manipulate women. The partner will threaten or harm the non-human animal, as well as the human, of course. And this is what we refer to as the violence link. I also wanted to draw attention to, is it in the best interests of these non-human animals that we love and care for and share our lives with, to continue to bring them with us through a very chaotic and transitional period, where sometimes it's very circular, where we know that women who are escaping violent partnerships or relationships, sometimes they leave over, and well, I believe the average is somewhere around 7 or 17 times before they actually successfully move out of and away from the violent situation. They, of course, go back. And so I really want to draw attention to, what does that mean for the non-human animals, whatever category you want to call them, and their agency. How is that even focusing or factoring into this at all? Very, very minutely. In my work, I find people talk a lot about the worry of this, and perhaps that it would be a good idea to reduce the barrier of companion animals in particular by allowing women with companion animals into the shelter together. But there wasn't very much awareness that maybe this isn't the best place for those non-human animals, and what does that mean? What is a better place? Who decides that? What does it look like? I don't think I have time to offer my thoughts on that, because it is a whole nother presentation, but I do believe that the current situation is extremely messy, and it isn't often in favor of those who are most vulnerable. I can say that the sociological contributions of this work, I really dealt with a lot of those isms. Absolutely, the survivors were kind of at the intersection of speciesism, gender or sexism, classism. As I said, these individuals are usually have little means to rent an apartment or buy a home on their own. They perhaps don't even have family where they could stay temporarily. And then, of course, I saw this instance of ableism, where certain disabilities were kind of respected and others were cast aside as not nearly as important. And so all of this, what I'm saying today, is really describing an intersectional compounding situation of inequity with a lot of power put into socially constructed categories. I consider homelessness and violence of this nature wicked social problems, meaning that the answers are not often agreed upon, and perhaps the answers are incredibly complex, if there even is one at the current time. I think it's really important to note the impact of systemic policies and practices on individual lives, as I found in myself and in my work. And of course, the ongoing effects of the patriarchy, because without that, perhaps we wouldn't need intimate partner violence shelters. They actually originated in Canada on the ground in the 1970s, kind of at the same time as one of the waves of feminism. And they were brought about by women for women to try to plug the hole, bridge the gap, and address something that was and is still ongoing in our society. So in summary, I want to thank you for listening to this, and to allowing me to share what I have learned so far. I can say that non-human animals' access to IPV shelters is completely dependent on their use value to humans. And in the situation where I had a few shelters that allowed companion animals, that was absolutely determined by those particular shelters and shelter workers. That was very much a voluntary, an issue that they had taken up on their own to try to do something about what they saw happening in their community to families, multi-species families. We can say that ESAs, SAs, and CAs are viewed as different categories of animal, that visible and invisible disabilities and emergency housing access are quite tied up together in a very inequitable sense. And of course, anthropocentric sheltering is really what I've been talking about this whole time, and questions around multi-species families, and most importantly, what does this all mean for those non-human animals in question? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah May. Now I would like to give everyone a chance to ask questions. You can see Sarah May has her email address there, so I'll leave we can leave the screen up for just a minute, so you can copy that down if you'd like it, and then we can start taking questions. You can raise your hand, or you can go ahead and type a question into the chat. Sarah May, did you want to stop the screen share? And while we wait for a question, I will go ahead and start. I know you said that this is too big of a question to get into in depth, but I just kept really wondering what you think of the shelters you've seen, the solutions that looked viable or appropriate, or at least like they're headed in the right direction for you. And you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, there were 3 types of co-shelters that were, and another model that were interesting. I don't think they're sufficient at all, but I think they're interesting attempts to talk about this and to think about this and to put something into action. So the co-shelters, one of them had an integrated co-shelter where they had managed for quite a few years to keep the non-human animals with the clients within the shelter, and had basically gone about that by making it clear that that was a priority of their particular shelter. So it was very much, like I said, instigated and maintained by those working in the shelter. Having said that, the model seemed to be working well for some. But there's also a whole bunch of other things tied to that, which lead me to my next, I guess, part of the answer is that none of the models that are currently in place, including temporary fostering of non-human animals, really does answer the question or help keep multi-species families together. All of them are temporary measures. So even the co-shelters in my sample, once those women had to move on, because I said most of them are a 30-day, maybe a 60-day stay. The very real thing that I didn't mention in my presentation is that almost all of those shelters said, we don't know where they're going to go. And most likely they wouldn't be able to take their non-human animal with them into the rental or affordable housing because of the types of guidelines and things that are in place in those facilities. And so I guess the short answer is we need a complete model that is much more holistic and inclusive, such as perhaps a sanctuary model. And I can say very shortly that if we consider the incredible amount of funding, effort, training, and brain power that is currently in place in these very precarious IPV shelters, and move that towards long-term places that don't discriminate or require you to be a certain ability, a certain species, to stay only for a certain amount of time, to be moving because of a certain circumstance, we have a much more promising conversation on our hands.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat from Alexandra Crane. Were the animals you encountered in co-shelters cats or dogs, and were there other species? And did you encounter species-specific policies?
Incredible speciesism within the shelters, which I didn't highlight in this talk. So when I spoke to the shelter workers about the instances where a companion animal might have been in the shelter, they were always cats, very rarely dogs, unless they were small, and other animals. I know some people mentioned rats, lizards, bunnies, There had been some talk, oh, sometimes we let them keep them in their room with them. It would depend on the size. It would depend on our familiarity with them. There was a lot of it would depend on. So absolutely, any kind of positive kind of, I think we might be able to manage would be a few cats at a time, perhaps a couple of small dogs, and maybe little animals if we couldn't really see them, which is basically absolutely speciesism was present and guided a lot of the actions and allowances that I found.
Thank you. Does anyone in the audience have a question? If you could use the hand raising feature, because that's the only way I'll notice you. Okay, great. So Ken.
Hi there, Sarah. Great presentation.
Hi,
My
Ken.
question is with regards to law enforcement, and some of the gap that I see is law enforcement responding to domestic dispute issues and getting there and not really having the ability to recognize the impact of these situations on animals, and vice versa. Neglect cases or animal cruelty cases where animal protection is coming in and not really having the ability to make the connection to family domestic violence. And I was wondering if you could talk a little maybe on how to bridge that gap with law enforcement and animal protection.
Absolutely. And I think that it's important to note that here in Canada anyways, we have a standing committee on the status of women. And a recent report, I think it was in June last year, spoke to this sort of directly. Their recommendations were, one, that non-human animals should be considered in instances of domestic or intimate partner violence. And two, more importantly, that those who are dealing directly with those individuals, so shelter workers, healthcare workers, law enforcement, anyone who is in a support role or could encounter these situations, I think exactly, in particular, the police force, people who are perhaps mental crisis intervention workers, anyone who has to, who family caseworkers, they should all be aware. And this is where it gets tricky. Being aware and trained and understanding the connection, the violence link, etc., is wonderful, but what can they do? Right? So I don't have a good answer for that, because right now the shelter system is in such distress in a multitude of ways. There aren't pathways set up to help immediately in those situations where decisions usually have to be made very quickly. Perhaps I know that many of the shelter workers I spoke to described women being brought into the shelter by the police in the back of a cruiser, often bleeding, because they had been removed, they had to be removed from a terrible situation. And so what happened to the companion animals? Well, in a lot of cases, they're still in that house. Or if they're not, are they in a shelter? Where did they go? The non-human animals are often not understood to be equally as affected, or maybe not a priority. For good reason, I can see, but also for terrible reasons that we don't view them as part of a family. If it was a child, there'd be something done. A human child. I hope that helps.
Thank you. There is another question on the chat. Irene did point out, wonders, I don't know if this is a question with a long answer, but I'll just read it in case anyone didn't see it. Are you familiar with the Purple Lotus Project in the United States? And put up a link to that for anyone interested. Are you familiar with it?
I'm not.
Okay. I am not either. So Irene, if you want to
But
jump
now I want to know.
if you
now
want
I want to know.
do you want to say anything about it, Irene, or else we can go to the next question?
Actually, it was a project that was started in Lorain County, Ohio, and it's a way of connecting resources for individuals who are impacted by intimate partner violence and the domestic or the animal shelters. So it's kind of a way of connecting animal shelters with domestic violence shelters.
Yeah, and I think that those partnerships are it is a useful and often a really necessary alternative to co-sheltering. But I do want to draw attention to the state of non-human animal shelters, which is what I did my MA on and continue to follow. It's atrocious. It's the prisons. There's absolute, there's not enough of them. There's not enough space. The type of facilities are traumatic in themselves. And there's often no guarantee that the non-human animal will be reunited with their family if that is the route that is taken. Often you have to sign away rights, because they're property, right, to the shelter. It is very hopeful when I hear of patchwork attempts to try to bridge that gap. But like I heard from quite a few people, and I know from my work, that if you're not in that particular region, you're out of luck. And so because it's not at a widespread, it's not in place everywhere, it's not reliable. A lot of my interviewees would say, well, sometimes we work with animal shelters if we can. They often don't have space, et cetera. They don't want to be involved in these kind of situations to begin with. They're overwhelmed. And so it comes back to the question of what is the shelter system doing or not doing? How is it doing? What is the state of it? And it's quite poor.
Thank you. We have one other question on our chat, and that is, it's from Jenny. She says, I'm wondering about, we have a couple actually, sorry, I don't want to skip anybody here. So we'll start with Ann Bird, and then we'll go to Jenny's question. In the course of your research, did you have occasion to contemplate the new animal welfare structures in Ontario to engage about policy perhaps, and whether they could be more influential about multi-species welfare in such cases as intimate partner violence?
I'm not quite 100% what the question is referring to, but I could, maybe could you expand on that?
Hi, sure.
Hi.
Hi, I'll turn on my video too. Well, it's as I listen to you, I think your work is just very compelling, first of all. And I was thinking about how in the last sort of 3 years, I've just recently retired from the Ontario government, and I was in on some parallel universe feelings of, with the prisons and
Okay.
investigation, that sort of stuff. But at the same time, they have really taken over. Ontario took over animal welfare, as you probably remember,
Right.
after the SPCA fiasco, whatever. And they've taken, I would say they're taking quite a bit more proactive approach. I kept an eye on it just because it's a big interest of mine too. And I wondered, I guess my feeling is that I think there could be a bit of a space for conversation at that level, in the provincial level, with the right people to contemplate how this multi-species thing could look and could actually work, and maybe be more workable with other sort of public spaces, that publicly supported spaces that are for victims of violence. And I'm not surprised to hear there's a patchwork out there, because it's just not really acknowledged. But I do have a sense that there could be some interest in having some of those conversations. So that's why I thought your work is pretty important.
Thank you. And I think that exactly what you're, thank you. I think that it's really important to know exactly what you have brought there, that so animal cruelty, as I kind of gestured to in my presentation, was not viewed as terrible or as punishable or as problematic as any kind of human type violence. And along with that were laws about what happens to individuals who do abuse or kill non-human animals. And, who takes care of that? Like the punishment were, often a little slap on the wrist, a fine. Maybe you can't own companion animals for a while. But actual sentences that would be tied to the violence of and the effects of the actual acts themselves were definitely not reflected in non-human animal cruelty laws. I think my concern with how the structure has come about here in Ontario and Canada is that there's concern that now that it's not a centralized, monitored, uniform, understood kind of cruelty force, and that it's become I don't know if I want to say sold or taken over by individual groups, but it's not a uniform anything. It's kind of like, well, each area in the country, in the province, that whatever group is looking after animal cruelty in our country or our region, it's a concern that it's become almost contracted out. How do you feel? What did your
Well, I would say actually, I've seen improvement on that very topic. So when I think that was one of the issues when the SPCA and individual humane societies were very deeply involved. So I used to be very involved with Toronto Humane Society, for example, which had a lot more rules and strong feelings than some of the others in the province. But I would say that from province to province, yes, I agree. I'm not even pretending to understand. And I now live in BC, so it's like a whole new world. But
it's different there. I know.
Yeah, it's different. But I think that you might find that with Ontario, there is a bit more of an overarching and strategic approach to these topics now than there was 3 years ago. So I'd leave it there. But I mean, I'm definitely going to share your work with some people that I'm still in touch with over there on the animal welfare side, for sure. Because I know the people at the very top are people that just genuinely really care about these things. And now I think what they've come to realize is that, we've talked today about a lot of companion animals, the ones that will move around with families, but there's just such a huge list out there of animals in Ontario that have been, are being mistreated in very weird and strange ways. So
thank you. And I thank you for clarifying that. I think that any kind of attention and perhaps focus on this can't be bad. And I will share just a quick something I learned and I started to think about more in my work, is that one of the workers described the situation of this woman in her community. She was a rural shelter. So her shelter was, a lot of the shelters around, at least in my province, are in urban areas, but this was a rural shelter. And she spoke about a woman, it was very well known in the community. She was abused year after year by her partner. The shelter workers had gone and tried to reach out to her and asked her to come in. They were very worried for her life. And the woman very clearly said, I'm not leaving because I can't bring my farm animals with me. And I can't bear to think about what will happen if I leave without them. And she just didn't, she never left. And so this is where I thought about sanctuaries being the very big ultimate solution or goal or space where some of this healing and support could happen, because of exactly this kind of thing where we're talking about species, which animals are in danger. It's not just cats, it's not just dogs, it's certainly not just the animals that I've spoken about today. These are any kind of non-human animals that are in the way or conveniently nearby in these situations.
So we have 5 minutes, and I'm going to try, maybe we can get to the last two questions in the last 5 minutes. So Jenny has a question in the chat, and Ken has a question as well. Jenny's question is, I'm wondering about speciesism, like quote unquote covering by the shelters. For instance, was size often used as a justification for why certain animals or species were not admitted rather than noting that certain species are not allowed. I wonder if justifications are couched as logistical rather than discriminatory. And if so, that could be a further challenge to social change here.
Mhm. Absolutely. And so I heard all different reasons. I heard allergies, I heard fear from the clients or the staff themselves. I've heard inexperience and a worry that the shelter workers would have more work than they could absolutely handle trying to care for non-human animals. And interestingly enough, though, they didn't really want to, this is something that I like to take up further, they didn't really say, well, you know, I couldn't do that for an iguana, but they would say things like, oh, but if we had too many big dogs at one time, I don't think we could handle that. It was more about quantity and sometimes about size. If there was any kind of mention about, well, I don't think we could handle X amount. In the co-shelter, one of the co-shelters in the sample, they had divided the space up. So there was a cat room, a small animal room, and then a larger kennel area for dogs. And so they had, I guess, directly kind of acknowledged the different environmental necessities. But it was limited. It was not a huge space we're talking about. So if, let's say, 50 of their clients all had 5 dogs, right, we have real logistical problems here, and also ethical problems about cramming too many. There's probably there'll be restrictions on how many non-human animals you could actually care for in a given circumstance.
Thank you. And Ken?
Sure, thanks, Carol. Yes, something Anne touched on with government regulation and such. And one thing that sometimes that I see is the intersection of different industries using animals in different ways, and somehow that becoming trying to get everybody on the same page to what actually is a standard of cruelty and neglect. And I'm just wondering if that's anything that you have come across or seen in your work you've done.
Can you just repeat the question for me, Ken? Sorry, just the basis of it.
Just with it, sometimes I've come across an intersection of different industries on how they use it, and what their standard of cruelty and neglect is, and somehow how that could have an impact on this type of work.
Well, I think that's a really good point. I immediately thought of going back to that rural example that some of the other people that I spoke to and other people I spoke to outside this project, when I broached animal agriculture and the line between that and family, there was maybe more pushback or surprise, or kind of almost like they're very credulous, like, oh, it's such a silly thing to consider, because there was definitely this kind of respect for those animals are used for X purpose, and these animals are used for more intimate, I guess you could say, immediate, ongoing purposes by humans. So very much the use value and is tied to all these incredible and horrific results. And like, I can't even begin to start to talk about animal agriculture and what that means, because I think it's important, if anything, to note that that there are individuals who view non-human animals who are not perhaps the stereotypical companion animal as equally important as part of their family, and that their use is not for food or clothing or whatever. But we have an awful long way to go, much beyond the already mess that we're in, unfortunately, to try to deal with that very long-standing constructed situation of the binary that I spoke of at the very beginning. I think that's a really important part of this work, and I appreciate you bringing that up. There's a lot more to do. Hope that helped.
With that, we are right at 1:30, or 1:30 my time. It's all different times for all of you. But we are at half past the hour. And so we will close out this colloquium. Hopefully you're on one of our email lists so that we can let you know when we have future talks. Dr. Sarah May Lindsay, I would like to say congratulations again on your very well-deserved degree. And thank you so much for sharing some of that work for us and for all the work that you're doing in this area. And thank you to everyone who is here for taking your time today and all the work that you're doing in the areas that you work in to help non-human animals and perhaps women who are experiencing some of the issues that Sarah May talked about today. I hope everyone has a good day and thank you so much.
Thank you.